This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. We've got an open mic show today for show number 570-something. I think it's 71, maybe 72. But looking forward to a great conversation with the Restoration Industry Global Watchdog, Pete Consigli. We've got Ed Light from down in the D.C. area, John Lapotaire out of Orlando, Florida. We've got Ken Larsen out of Destin, Florida. And we've got Jay Stake hopefully coming in. And I want to pull Don Weekes in to bring the Canadian perspective in. Before we get started, let's thank our platinum sponsor.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com.
I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Particles Plus, Healthy Indoors Magazine, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, and AEML Inc. Laboratory. And of course, our association sponsors, SIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, the Indoor Air Quality Association, and the Restoration Industry Association. Okay, no Z-Man today, so I'm going to handle the micro band. Wow, we're going way back there. The trivia question for today, the ideas trivia question. I'm going to make it real simple. I'd like you to let us know the country of origin, not where they live now, the country of origin of the editors of the first Green Book, Recognition, Evaluation, and Control of Indoor Mold. I think I know the correct answer, but we'll find out in just a minute. All right, so we're going to have an open mic show today. Looking forward to talking to our group of distinguished guests, and I think I'm going to throw out the first topic here. And I want to start with the hurricane recovery and get a little update from our Florida guest today on hurricane recovery. I want to start with Mr. Ken Larsen. Ken, what's going on after the tremendous issues you've had down there over the last few years? How are things coming back? What kind of things did we learn from the big storms that hit Florida?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Am I coming through good?
A little, yeah, not bad. A little low.
Okay. So, Panama City Beach is still under repair. It's looking so much better than what it once did, but it's still got a lot of work to go. When you drive down the roads, you still see a lot of the forest and the trees are all snapped in half. They are starting to grow back, but it's still, you can tell it's a disaster zone. A lot of the houses that are being repaired there, they have been completed, but even to this day, I mean, I'm still getting phone calls from people who haven't had anything done in their homes yet. That's 15 months later, and it's still got the original damage in it, and nobody's done anything in those homes.
Wow.
So a lot of that is the result of either their claims were denied, so they're going through the legal efforts to try and get that claim approved, or they didn't have insurance, and so they just abandoned the house, gave it back to the bank, or possibly they're selling it for pennies on the dollar. I was just in a house just last month. It's about an $8 million house, sold for just a couple million, but all the original damage is still in there. And so, there's a lot of work to be done.
Wow, Ken, let me go back to that for just a minute. That's very interesting. You'd think that someone that owns an $8 million home would have the resources or the insurance to get it repaired and not to take a $6 million haircut. Do you know a little more about the situation there?
Well, yeah, in that particular case, there's all kinds of financial issues. He had bankruptcy before and some other things.
Okay.
So there's usually a long story to every one of those situations, and it's details that aren't really important. Bottom line is that there's still a lot of work to be done there, and these are serious situations. The other thing that I got to tell you, this has really been interesting. I was talking to one of my customers, and he's a therapist, and he said it is unbelievable the amount of therapy that is required from the citizens. There's so many that are traumatically affected from this storm, especially the children. They said that's what he's really getting busy with, is the children in schools that are suffering from mom and dad losing their job, or being living in a tent for months. These kids still have to go to school, and it's just a real challenge for them.
Wow, that's something you don't really think about when you think about hurricanes and storm recovery, is the mental stress that people were put under. I appreciate you bringing that up.
I was talking to another one of my colleagues who actually stayed in one of the houses during the storm, and so we all we're all sitting around shaking our head at the guy. What were you thinking of? I mean, he would know better. And so the conversation eventually got to the point where we asked him, when did you think, or when did you realize you made a bad decision to stay in this house? What did you see? What did you hear? And of course, the storm is howling outside. He said, I realized I was in trouble when I looked out my living room window and saw a refrigerator going down my road at 80 miles an hour. He said, that's when I realized I had a problem.
Wow. Interesting. Ken, the damage wasn't just limited to Panama City. There was, widespread damage. How have the other areas fared? Are they all coming back pretty well now?
Well, interesting you say that. So Mexico Beach is a small community. I'm guessing maybe 30 or 40,000 people or so, right on the beach, and it got absolutely obliterated. I mean, it was to the point where the houses, you don't even see the foundation. It's gone. It's just gone. And so those houses are slowly coming back, and the houses that they're building there are nice and new and modern, and they look great. So that community, when it's all finished, is going to be, I think, a real desirable location to go and visit. But there's still a lot of work going on there. There's other, that's just so you know, Mexico Beach is east of Panama City, and about possibly 15 miles, maybe 10 miles. And that was, the hurricane central right there. It just hit so hard.
Hey, let's get John Lapotaire in here. John, I noticed you said many have over $1 million deductible. That's just amazing. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. A lot of our clients that have massive homes and very large properties, and even if they're covered by some of the high-end insurance companies, their deductibles on a $10 million house could be $1 million, $2 million, just to keep the insurance payments reasonable. So even though you would think that these guys have the means to manage their loss, it's typically on a larger home, in my experience, all out of pocket.
Wow. What kind of homeowners insurance? You live in Orlando, John. I mean, what's a typical Orlando suburban, $300,000, $400,000 home? What do they pay for insurance in Florida?
Well, that varies so greatly, even in Orlando. Many people live in a flood zone. We're relatively flat, so I literally live across the street from someone who's not in a flood zone while I am. But the back of my house is a wilderness area. It's woods. But part of that woods is rather swampy. So it can range from a few $1,000s to $10,000, depending on where you live and whether or not you're in a flood zone. And a lot of us in Florida are in flood zones.
And the deductible can be pretty high as well. Ken, what about in your area of Florida? Does that kind of, similar?
Yeah, absolutely. And John replied correctly. It's there's a wide variety of different rates depending on where you are. So if you're in a really desirable tourist location, there's going to be expensive houses on the beach, high risk, and lots of money to be spent. So the premiums are high. It depends on where you are.
I mean, you're talking $3,000 just for insurance. That's a lot of money. And then what about taxes on top of that? I mean, the taxes aren't as high, I guess, or?
Yeah, there's certainly, good tax, property tax that we have to pay. That's not really something I follow too much. I kind of
Okay.
Just leave that to the wife. But
John, any thoughts on that? Taxes?
Yeah, just like anywhere else, the closer you live to downtown Orlando or the theme parks, the higher your tax base. If you go where I live, my taxes are very low because I'm displaced from the rest of the hubbub where people want to live. I'm one of those few that would rather live away from that. So I have very low taxes, but I have a pretty healthy insurance policy because I also live where I'm in a floodplain and a lot of trees that could hit the house.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to have both of you guys address before we move to another topic is what lessons did we learn here with respect to both the inspection, assessment, and the remediation of some of these homes after this event? Start with you, Ken.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that, because that was something I thought was quite revealing, is that there's a lot of contractors that came into town from out of town to help out with the damages. And a lot of those companies, as with most hurricanes, a lot of those companies aren't very reputable and they don't do good work and they're out on the take. That's quite literally what they're doing. And they come into the job, they do substandard work, and they put in this big old fat invoice with the expectation that they're going to get beat up down the road. And so they end up taking, 30-40% of what they originally invoiced, and they accept that. And now the end result is that the entire restoration community gets a black eye from those practices, because the insurance claims representatives, they think that everybody should be dropping their bill 60% because the last guy did it. So it's really, bad that way. So the really good companies that are interested in their reputation, they are surrounding themselves with experts. It's an astonishing development to see how the reputable companies are no longer trying to do this by themselves. They're bringing in consultants, IEPs, engineers, subject matter experts, attorneys, public adjusters. If you try and do this on your own, you're going to get beat up real bad. So they just, bring in a whole bunch of people and the claim gets settled fairly.
John, let's go to you, and then I want to get Pete to jump in here.
Yeah, I agree with Ken. I think it's very unfortunate in our state when we have natural disasters. There has become a very clear division in the two different kinds of contractors. And that's the long-standing contractor that works well with consultants, documents everything, and is working truly for the client to get them restored. And then there's the opportunistic guys that are waiting for a hurricane and want the massive loss so they can do as much work as they can. They tend to work without consultants and IEPs. And if they are working with a consultant or an IEP, they're working together, meaning that they pay each other. And they exaggerate the loss and they're prepared to negotiate. And it really, really gives Florida a bad reputation, and it pits the insurance industry against the restoration industry. But I will say, I agree with Ken that the good guys are getting much better. And it's easier to distinguish the good reputable companies based on their documentation and their willingness to work with good consultants and IEPs and independent adjusters.
Interesting. Pete, let me let you jump in here. Any thoughts on this? I mean, you're the RIA, Restoration Industry Global Watchdog. What do you think?
Well, Industry Global Watchdog, I don't even want to send a message I speak for RIA, but
right.
I mean, look, what some of the stuff that Ken and John just talked about, quite frankly, I think would echo many of the members of RIA and IAQA, the remediators, the assessors. It's particularly in Florida, there's about 20,000 guys that have to be licensed to do mold assessment or mold remediation that dates back over a decade when this whole thing kind of hit the radar after the second or the third S520 and a lot of state activity happened. So I always talk about the big three, which is Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. Those kind of lead the country. There are other states that have some laws in Maryland, New York, and a few others, but it's not the same as the big three. They're right in, humidity central, if you would. They're going to get hurricane and heavy tropical storms every year, whether they want them or not. So that 20,000, those guys need 14 continuing education units every 2 years, and it has to be approved. These the vendors that supply that through what's called the DPR, that's the Department of Professional Regulation of Florida. And let me tell you, it's not easy to get that stuff approved through them. It's a tedious process. They kind of pretty tough on the regulation. It's not like getting industry CECs, and most of those are fairly easy. As long as it's not promotional. So they do try to enforce that, but having said that, John made the key point when he dovetailed off Ken. There's just a lot of cowboys down here, and it is to quote what Cliffwood might say, it is about the good and the bad, and the good and the evil. You're going to have guys that are forthright and want to do the right thing, whether it's in the team approach or however they're going to go about it. And then you just have the carpetbaggers that come from out of the area, and even some of the local companies that just want to kind of make deals with the devils. They want to create these fights with the TPAs and the insurance companies. And, it's not to say that the insurers and the TPAs are angels. I mean, we all know they're not. But it would seem that it would be better than just the nasty way that it's been. And this has just accelerated over the last several years. It started in 2017 with Irma and Maria and all that, and now culminated last year with Michael, which is most of the discussion now, because that's kind of the hot one on the table that Ken was talking about. So, the final thing I'll say is we, John was involved, and we did the show last July with Joe. I did the blog on that with the town hall that we did right after the AOB law was changed in Florida. Mm-hmm. And we had opposing viewpoints with Harvey Cohen, with David Popper, with Peter Prosa. It was very well received, and one of your show sponsors, AML, hosted that, with the Cohen Law Group. Now, what I'll say is I think it's time potentially to do another one of these town halls in 2020 and expand the group of the panel to bring in some of these other experts, the team approach, and get all the opposing viewpoints. And because I think that Florida, Joe, it leads the way globally on this interaction between the insurance industry and the property restoration industry. I think the way it goes in Florida impacts the nation and impacts the globe. And don't think for a minute that that's an over-exaggeration, because all these, in the digital age we live in now, these insurance companies have global impact. The associations are starting to, globally organize, and everybody looks at best practices. And it used to be Southern California, what I always called was the ground zero, was the hot thing. Now it's Florida, particularly South Florida in particular, particularly those counties. A lot of affluence down there, and there's a lot of the new Wild West of South Florida. So anyway,
the other thing that Florida is kind of, I see it kind of leading the way on, is this whole licensing issue. After Florida did it, you got New York, they've done it now, and you've got D.C., and you've got other states talking about it. New Jersey, New Hampshire has a little something. So I don't think it's just the insurance area either. But let me ask this to Ken and or John, jump in here. Was there any enforcement of the licensing law after the hurricane that you're aware of? Have you seen any articles on it? Have you heard anyone talk about that, the Department of whomever came in and told somebody they had to have a license?
So I'll go first on that. That is a massive subject for Hurricane Michael. There were just so many contractors that were charged and thrown in jail for doing work in Florida without the appropriate licenses. And surprisingly, a week ago, I just heard that a really good restoration contractor, somebody sent me a clip showing that he was arrested and charged with several counts of doing work on Hurricane Michael on structures without the appropriate licensing. And I haven't talked to him in a week, so I gather he's in jail still trying to figure that out.
Is
there's
that
a lot of people that got in trouble with that.
Now,
Hey, Joe, before John jumps in on that, let me dovetail off of what Ken said. He's talking about the state contracting law, which oversees, the mold assessment licensing and the mold remediation licensing, which is really big. I mean, I lived in the West Coast in California for over 20 years, and they're very proactive in that. There were contractors that have been cited and have been locked up out there too. California in particular, and a lot of these Western states, they run these amnesty programs every 3 years to get people to be in compliance. But let me tell you about Florida. A lot of the people that I have talked to who do business in Florida, many of our REA members, a lot of these guys who do national business, okay, they have to get licensed in all these specific states. Florida in particular has not only state licensing, there could be county licensing, local localities. Yeah. So when people come here who don't, particularly if you don't live in the state, you got to be sensitive to that. A lot of times it's better to partner with a guy who's already based here, work under their license, that kind of thing. And I think somebody like John Lapotaire is a long-term resident here. John, maybe you could dovetail and weigh in on that. Throw it back to you, Joe.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, as far as licensing is concerned, the state itself is doing a really good job after natural disasters in checking licensing. For whatever reason, our website gets a lot of hits because we post a lot on our website about the state licensing law. So we get a tremendous amount of calls after a natural disaster from contractors wanting help to figure out how to get licensed after they were caught without a license. Mm-hmm. So they do a pretty good job of it, but it doesn't mean that there aren't repeat offenders. I will also add that it's not necessary to have a license in the state of Florida if you're working under the supervision of someone that has a license. So as long as you say, I'm working with Mike, and Mike has a license, and they contact Mike, and Mike says, yes, I'm supervising them, you're okay. And you'll see a lot of franchises from all over the country swarm the state of Florida during a natural disaster, and the franchisees are working under each other's licensing, and that's completely acceptable in the law.
Yeah, so Joe, that's what I was commenting on, because that means that the guy who's putting his license at risk is ultimately responsible. So he's going to be a local, and he's got roots to the community. And if he's willing to allow a guy to work under that license, you got to figure he trusts him. So that's okay. The main point of all this, don't do business in the state, in any of these states with contract licensing, unless you have a license or unless you're working under someone's license. Otherwise, you're really at risk. And particularly after the hurricanes, and particularly in areas where there are aging populations, California, Arizona, Florida in particular, the state attorney general's office are very active of these scams and taking advantage, not just the general population, but particularly the aging population, because they're susceptible to that.
Great point, Pete. All right, what I'd like to do is turn it over and bring Ed Light into the conversation here. Most of you know Ed out of the D.C. area. And Ed, I kind of want to switch gears, change topics a little bit, talk about another hot topic out there. And I don't mean to, it's fires, okay? And fire, wildfires, and also just, fire restoration has been a hot topic, especially with all the wildfires here in the west, out west, and also in Australia right now. And Ed, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on what you're seeing with respect to testing, and whether or not there's been any good protocols put out by AIHA or others for doing some evaluation, after a fire, to determine what areas have been affected and what areas haven't.
So the big question here is, how do you assess smoke damage, and how do you verify it's cleaned up? So, this is wildfires and any kind of fires. And so what we're hearing from my friends at the American Industrial Hygiene Association, the labs and the scientific consultants, is their fascination with sampling and using that data, just as they've done for years with mold. And the basic question is, does this data answer the questions you're looking at? And my position is it does not tell you the health risks, the contamination, the restoration needs, and it doesn't tell you whether the place is restored. So AIHA originally had me on their group to write up a guide and protocol and so on, and I've kind of phased out of that because I believe that the folks writing it generally aren't familiar with restoration, building science, and with the nitty gritty of dealing with smoke. And so I'm very proud to be working now with the IICRC group, writing a actual national approach protocol for fire restoration. And I really appreciate Cliff brought me in, volunteered me for that. And so we're busily working away with a team from around the world of restorers, and I'm kind of the scientific advisor on the group, and I don't have an opinion unless I go in and get dirty myself and participate in some of these jobs. And what we're coming up with on the assessment and verification is practical procedures to really determine what you need. You know, what's the damage, what's the overall exposure, what you got to do to restore it, and how do you verify it. So look forward to when we get done debating and crafting the language to that coming out.
Ed, I'm wondering, you know, we're getting close to halftime, but I think you could answer this one pretty quickly. What are you saying? There's no role for sampling, or just we don't have enough data, enough scientific backing to actually determine whether there's a role for sampling on these fire projects?
Well, there, in some cases, that information might be helpful to answer minor questions, but they're not going to give you the big picture answer to what's the scope of the contamination, what are you going to do about it, and has it worked? So, for example, if there's a very specific medical situation and a need to find out exactly what chemical the person's being exposed to, some sampling would give you some information. But in working with good, experienced restorers, their understanding of the type of contamination and where it is to develop a way to deal with it is really the knowledgeable and conclusive approach. So yeah, samples are interesting. They will tell you a very limited idea of what's in this square inch. Now, when you get to the tests and the type of tests, there really is no good research saying what are the key contaminants, what are the parameters, and no criteria at all that are accepted or valid in terms of drawing any conclusions from this data. And of course, labs are always glad to say, oh, look at these magic numbers, run our tests, and you can write a report. So that's kind of where we're at with fires, and it certainly needs more testing in regard to research to understand exactly what we're dealing with, what we're exposed to, and maybe eventually there could be some tests. But as of right now, when I go in, I don't do testing.
Well, you know what?
Use my nose and my fingers quite a bit.
What I'd like to do, Ed, is break for halftime, thank our sponsors, and when we come back, I'd like you to go ahead and talk a little bit about how you would perform an investigation both before and after a fire. And then I want to bring Pete in. I know RIA's been working on some programs, and he may have a little more background on where they're headed with this issue, and I think maybe they're working with IICRC on it. I don't know. But we're going to stop and thank our sponsors. We'll be back in 90 seconds with the second half of our open mic show.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Gold sponsors are Particles Plus Engineers and Manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at AEMLinc.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at IAQA.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry. Network with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org.
CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at ciriscience.org. That's CIRI science.org. Okay, we're back for the second half. We've got Ed Light, we've got John Lapotaire, we've got Pete Consigli, we've got Ken Larsen, and at some point here I want to get, actually I think after we have Ed go through his protocol a little more, we'll get Don Weekes in to weigh in a little bit as well. Ed, before the half we were talking about how you investigate a fire and then develop a scope of work, I guess, and then clear a fire. Essentially it's a white glove type of thing.
Well, first of all, if I'm involved, we don't go in and say we're the expert, do the assessment, and tell people what to do. It's got to be teamwork between the parties involved, and hopefully if we have a good, knowledgeable contractor, I want them to take the lead and propose what they think's going on, what they should do. And the proper role of an informed industrial hygienist should be to work with them and perhaps fine-tune it. The approach to assessment with smoke that I believe in is just a systematic approach of the tried and true methods. And I worked and talked considerably with the late Marty King on our approaches to this, and visual and make sure it's systematic and comprehensive. And we have an odor protocol, and it's not chemistry that you need to measure, but a systematic worst case, space by space evaluation of odor, and from that you determine a scope of work and let the contractor pick appropriate methods to achieve that. And the proper role, I believe, of the industrial hygienist in mold and smoke is to help the contractor get that done, verify it, and I'll be working with the group at IICRC to try to get a general outline and approach of smoke damage assessment, cleanup, and verification.
All right, Ed. I think a lot of our restoration people would be very happy to hear that. You laid out a really nice way of working together. Let's get Don Weekes in on the phone here. Don, we got to unmute you. Don, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Don, I don't know that you've done a whole lot with fire, but I could be wrong. Do you have any comments, any follow-up on that?
Listen, mostly I think that the Ed's approach is very much the way I would follow as well. I want to differentiate, though, between, say, a home fire, where you have a one location fire, and wildfires, which obviously are much in the news right now in Australia, but previous to that, we're very much in the news here in Canada with the wildfires we had about 18 months ago.
Right.
Those types of fires where you have a great deal of total particulates, PM10, PM2.5, those are quite different in terms of the way in which public health officials may want to approach that, as opposed to, say, for example, a single home fire where obviously there's a need to have a team effort to operate on that basis. The reason that I say there's a difference is on the wildfires, obviously the air quality becomes not something that's a minor issue. It becomes a much more major issue for populations, and they're dealing with very high concentrations that can lead to a variety of different types of health effects, including, unfortunately, people who have passed away from the high exposures to these types of particulates and other types of chemicals that are associated with fires. So my experience has been more along those lines, particularly here in Canada. We get a periodic or yearly season where we have fires of that nature in Quebec, and the air quality here in Ottawa then becomes extremely difficult to deal with. And these are massive fires that people really don't know how to even address. But it does take into account the fact that there is an air quality problem with regards to these types of fires that needs to be looked at from a public health viewpoint, and that's where industrial hygienists may be able to fit in terms of that. And what I've done with Health Canada is basically serve as a scientific advisor in terms of that. And I think it's important, as I said, to look at it from two different viewpoints. I agree with Ed on an individual fire that his approach is the way to go. On a community-wide fire, such as we have had in Australia and here in Canada, it's a little different story and a little bit different to perspective as to how to go about dealing with the air quality problems that may exist.
And Dawn, when you're dealing with a wildfire, are they looking more at like just PM 2.5 and PM 10, and not necessarily what's in that PM 2.5 or 10?
Yeah, initially that's the case because it's a relatively easy measure to do. But you're right. Some of the advice I've given to some of these police departments and fire departments and others is you have to protect your workers that are there too, because quite frankly, you don't know what might be else burning or what else has become part of the smoke.
Yeah.
So it becomes an issue for those workers as well as for the people who are, whose property are being burnt as well.
And that, now in Australia, they're having problems, for instance, in hospitals and other, care facilities where they're wondering, should we perform operations or not while we've got this situation going. So it's an very interesting topic. I want to bring Ken Larsen back in on this, and maybe Pete, you guys could talk a little bit about any other efforts. I mean, RIA for years has been dealing with fire, and I think at one point they were working with the IICRC on some of these fire standards, and IAQA actually. Where are we at with that, guys?
Ken, why don't you go first, and then I'll do a recap on this topic.
Yeah, I don't have anything to really contribute on that. I'm not up to speed with what the IICRC is doing with the new fire standard. I'll let somebody else answer that.
Okay. Pete?
Yeah. All right. So listen, I've been listening here. First of all, Ed's approach is a very logical approach. And if the Z-Man heard him talk, he'd get all excited because he's always kind of liked Ed's approach that dates back to the 90s when we first met with him. He was working locally in the DC area with Davidge and other long-term industry insiders. But in particular, a lot of people don't realize Ed started working with the IICRC, and he was involved in the late 90s on the second S500 water damage, and he brought a very logical kind of approach to the process. because that was kind of the mold as gold days first started. And I think you could see now, 2 decades later, he still hasn't changed his viewpoint. He still has that same approach as applied to smoke. Now, what Ed was talking about, and to kind of bring this in context for the audience, is if you recall back when we did the Strategic Alliance show last fall,
Yep.
when the IACRC and REA did their Strategic Alliance, we did a series of shows on IAQ Radio. The standards activity of all the REA standards is now in the IICRC lane, and that was part of the agreement. So REA is working with IICRC on that process, and that's kind of what Ed's talking about. And that the roots of that were the original 10 years of work that REA did. Now IICRC is basically essentially going to bring it to market. Now, 2 big points that are contentious, and they were contentious even at the tail end of the REA process before it went over to IICRC, and it is what is going to be in the standard the involvement of these outside consultants in the IEPs. That was a big issue with the water standard from the late 90s to when it became an ANSI document, and as it evolved, we used to call them third-party consultants with water. Now they're IEPs. That was part of the mold era in the early 2000s. So what Ed was talking about, that in Marty King's philosophy exists with a lot of people on the committee today, that you got to defer first to the common sense approach, what you visually can see, what you can smell, whether it's white glove. You do these inspections before you just want to jump to the sampling and start running up these bills and think that people are playing with monopoly money. And so, but the roots for some of the criteria for whatever testing might be done does date back to the standard that REA did with the IESO, and that was all under the IAQA banner on dealing with the interior of the ducts. There was NACA support for that too, and they wanted to determine the primary purpose of that was to determine how you differentiate just normal soiling from soot, and that the char was the indicator, and that was used to determine to set scope. In other words, is this smoke related, or is it just normal soiling, which would be maintenance and wouldn't be covered under insurance? And then if they do remedial work, any kind of restoration, you would use that same protocol to determine, well, have they removed it? Has that char marker been removed versus, it wasn't? And so there are consultants and people that were working judiciously in that context. And I would hope that it continues in that way. And what I don't think that we want to see happen, at least I don't, I can speak for myself, but there are others who would support that, is we don't want to see the consultants hijack the fire restoration industry, kind of like it's happened in mold, to be quite honest with you. And, the other thing that I will also bring up that kind of ties up some of the stuff that we got into pretty heavily on the first part of the show, Joe, if a lot of the viewers can't see, but the chat line that's going, there's a lot of discussion on licensing. And quite frankly, licensing is not necessarily the answer, and it's fraught with all kinds of issues. So it is a double-edged sword. I mean, most of the time, if industry can self-regulate, it's much better. And usually the government will allow that to happen. But when it gets out of control, like it has in Florida, that's the reason why the government comes in. And then we have to deal with the results of licensing. I'm particularly in the mold area and these special areas. I mean, general construction licensing, that's existed for years. That's not going to go away. But some of this other licensing. So anyway, that's probably all I got to say on that. I mean, if Ken or John, Ed, anybody wants to weigh in on that, certainly feel free. If there are any other questions, Joe, that you think need to be clarified, go ahead and weigh in before you move to another topic.
Let me jump to John Lapotaire. I wanted to see if you had anything to add. I don't know how much you deal with fire restoration, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I lost you for a minute there. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir. You're back.
There we go. Yeah, I try real hard to stay away from fire, unless it's a wildfire, and we have clients that want to know if they have particulate issues to deal with after a fire. But I try real hard to stay away from house fires. It's just far too dirty for me.
Understood, buddy. All right, Ken, was there anything you wanted to add before I go to another topic?
Yeah, on that subject, I will tell you that there is I'm getting asked more and more to assist in establishing scopes for fire repair and smoke damage and determining how far the smoke went and what the full scope of work is. And there's a lot of questions about how you conduct these samples and how you interpret them and what thresholds you should be using. And, the new chemical compounds that are, potentially produced. I had one client that had me specifically go into her house and test for VOCs and determine if the VOCs produced there could be causing the health issues that she's got. And that is just full of landmines when you get into a discussion like that. So it can get real tricky. But I think it's a need for the future is that there needs to be some easier way to determine the scope of work on a fire and smoke loss. And just before we jump off this subject, I just wanted to quickly say that I really hope that contractors realize or will be reminded that sealants and encapsulants, that white pigmented product that you put on, that so many contractors are putting on the timber, that is a last resort. That is not a solution. It is something that you do when everything else fails. It's and so many people are looking for this silver bullet product that you can just paint onto the building and the building's problems go away. I think there needs to be a strong reminder to contractors that is not a competent method to restore fire and smoke damaged structures, to simply paint them in pigmented shellac. That's not a responsible protocol.
Okay, thank you, Ken.
Hey, Joe.
Pete.
Joe, let me weigh in on that now. If the Z-Man was here, he'd jump off the screen.
He loves his his shellac.
Well, I want to qualify what Ken said.
Please do.
It isn't as much as a last resort. I think the key point is there's too many contractors who don't do any cleaning to physically remove the source first, right? This is the basics of all odor removal, any kind of remedial work. And what happens is they want to go just start to spray a bunch of sealers, and then they want to paint. That doesn't work. That's the scourge. What happens is the primary point, and not all sealers are alike, and as you well know through your Healthy Building Summit, Cliff has done research on this, okay? And he's advocated for this for years through all of his unsmoked training, long before there was Legends. I won't get into all the brand naming on the sealers, but some work better than others. But the key point is that the primary purpose of a sealer is normally not as much for odor control as it is for bleed through, okay? When you do thorough cleaning of a surface, let's say a enamel painted wall in a kitchen where there was significant heat, you could clean the heck out of that wall and the wall's going to look dirty. And people, and the homeowner, if they happen to be watching, think you didn't do a good job. No, the heat softened the paint. And what happened is the smoke got in there. So you clean the surface residue. The purpose you seal that is so that you won't get bleed through in your paint. It really doesn't have anything to do with the odor removal, because the odor removal is based on cleaning and everything else you do on the project. So I think it's important to clarify that there's a use and application for sealers, not necessarily as a last resort, but as a part of the process to lock stain in. And this is something that painters for years have used on water losses, like on baseboards. They call it back priming. Mm-hmm. So what happens is they'll put some kind of a shellac or something on the back for staining, so that when they paint, the whatever particulates are in the water, they don't bleed through, and then 2 months later you'll see little staining above the baseboard line on the paint. So anyway,
thank you, Pete. Hey, before we go to the roundup, I want to either Pete or Ken, whomever wants to do this, I want to get a quick update on the AGA. That's something that got a lot of traction early on. I haven't seen as much here recently, but I'm sure there's a lot going on I'm not aware of. Who wants to handle that?
Yeah, I'll chime in on the AGA. This is a really exciting industry development that the Advocacy and Governmental Affairs Committee has been created by the RIA, and it's chaired by Ed Cross. And we've got several committees in that group that are focusing on the many different demographics in our industry that present challenges to the restoration contractor and in the settlement of the claims process. So, I mean, contractors, we for the most part, we have very similar challenges day to day. And so that might be coming from third-party administrators, maybe third-party consultants that show up on the job, preferred vendor programs with the insurance companies, and misuse or intentional misuse of the software programs present in our industry. These are all challenges that contractors face every day. So the AGA has put together several committees with their own particular focus on assisting in resolving these challenges. So there's a lot of enthusiasm with this group. The thing that I am most excited about is the industry support. The restorers are jumping on this investment opportunity, because really when you think about it, it's not a donation that they would give to the AGA. They're investing in their industry's future with these donations. And so there's a lot of people that are being very generous and contributing towards it. The AGA needs to have the industry support, and it's using that money extremely wisely and frugally, and they are revealing their positive successes. And so I encourage everybody to watch for Ed Cross's emails and his video posts where he's describing what they've accomplished. And it's exciting. This industry is finally starting to evolve into something that is at least is going to be hopefully one day more fair than it is today. And it's progressing. I'm pretty excited about it.
Thank you, Ken. I think what we're going to do is go to the roundup here, John. Yeah, all right. Before we go around the horn here, I want to mention real quick IAQA's 2020 annual meeting and expo, February 19th through the 21st, West Palm Beach. Go to the IAQA website for more information. AEML, one of our sponsors, Winter Break 2020, the Winter Break South Florida Technical Conference on Mold, sponsored by AEML. That's going to be February 21 and 22, so while you're in the area, you could probably catch both shows. We'll put a link up to that website as well. And RIA's 2020 International Restoration Convention and Industry Expo will be April 13 through 17 in New Orleans, Louisiana. We'll have that link up as well. Let's go around the horn and just get some final thoughts before we have a really interesting outro today. Ed has a new song. Let me see if I have the title right here. Sandstone. I got it, Ed. Sandstone Haze. So stick around for the end of the show. You're going to get, I think, the first live performance of Sandstone Haze. All right, let's go around the horn. John Lapotaire. John, any final thoughts? Whatever's on your mind, you can either follow up on things we talked about or mention something that's upcoming.
Yeah, I wanted to remind everybody that the IICRC is right at their mold assessment standard, the S530. I believe they met last week, the board, to try and put together a chair for the committee. So keep yourself open to what's going to be another mold assessment standard. We hope that it is a complement to the current ASTM standard and isn't a standalone walk away. But we hope that many of the different industry organizations work together to make it a good standard.
Thank you, John. Let's go to Ed. Ed Light, final thoughts before we go to your solo?
No, I'm saving time for my song.
All right, you got it, buddy. Let's go over. You know what? Can you bring Dawn Weekes back in? I want to get Dawn to get a final comment in here too. Dawn, we'll bring you on here in just a second. I want to get a final. Dawn, I know one thing that I want to comment on is the new Green Book is coming out, and we have J. David Miller on 2 weeks from today. He's one of the editors of the new Green Book. I'm just wondering, what should we be looking for with respect to significant changes in that document? I understand about 80% of the document has been changed. Any key points you'd like to point out?
Yeah, I think that the main thing is that the focus is on what has happened since the initial Green Book came out in 2008. It has been 12 years. And their focus is really on what are the latest processes for doing analysis or investigations for mold infestations, and really talking about what is the issues with regards to any type of sampling that's done. They're using that as a basis for discussion of how to approach any type of mold problem out there that you might have in your building. So that's a really different type of approach than what was done in the 2008 first publication, for which I was a co-editor on. This one, they kicked me out as a co-editor and brought in Steve Caulfield. Actually, he's done an excellent job in bringing the industrial hygienist perspective to it. So, and I just want to mention one other thing on the ACGIH meeting or call next week for IAQ Radio.
Yes.
You got the chance to meet with Frank Mortal, who is the new executive director of ACGIH. I'm on the board of directors to ACGIH, so I need to at least let Frank know that he's going to be getting as big a crowd as you have today next week as well. So thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Don. Always great to have you join us. Let's go to Ken Larsen.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say is I hope to see everybody at the RIA convention in New Orleans coming up in April. That'll be good. Be sure to support your AGA. They're making big changes for your industry. They're requesting investments of 0.1% of your annual gross. If you do the math on that, that's a very minimal amount. But if we can get that kind of commitment from the industry's participants, that should be plenty to keep the AGA making big changes for our industry. And finally, the other thing I wanted to mention was just a reminder to use your indoor environmental professionals on your insurance claims. It seems to be the trend for reputable contractors in order to assist in diminishing the disputes at the end of the claim.
Thank you, Ken. Always a pleasure having you join us. Pete, final thoughts before we go to our Ed Light solo.
Oh, has Ed weighed in yet, or you have him?
No, he's holding off to give him more time for the song.
Oh, okay. So listen, the only one of the things I like to say is that, and I'm gonna all the IAQA, the AML event, REA, all those sponsors. I'm gonna put those links in the blog, along with that link on the Canada Health that Don Weekes provided me. He put that link up in the IM chat, so some of you saw that. I'm going to put that link in the blog so everybody can kind of have access to Canada's position on the fire. I already checked it out; it's pretty good. But the other thing too is, Joe, is as many of the listeners may know, RAA has for 2 years now has been holding an annual convention in June, right after our Memorial Day, in Australia. And this June it'll be the third year, and the IICRC supports it. They've been supporting it for years, even before the strategic alignment agreement that we had with RAA last fall. And they got a big footprint there, and a lot of the suppliers we know, plus a lot of the local suppliers, they always get a certain amount of the North Americans that go over to help participate in the programs. And then part of the goal is a lot of the different guys in North America can go over, attend that packagification on, and write the trip off. It's kind of the strategy. So I'm going to put the link. They have their own landing page on the RA website just for the Australian event. Everything on the U.S. stuff is on there. If you visited this site recently and didn't see too much details, it all was uploaded yesterday. So go back to the site. All the details are there. The one other heads up I'll give, and this is kind of a shout out for John Downey and your indoor air quality people on here. Those of you that read the technical journal that he has, the last word that he had in the last journal, he talked about, he went over to Hawaii, and I'm not sure whether Richard Shaughnessy went, but ISIAC and the CIRI in 2021 are co-holding, are going to co-locate their annual conference in Hawaii. It happened to be the same week that the Aussies normally hold their conference. So I sent a message to those guys and I told them to try to book theirs the week before or the week after. And maybe the industry can do some global, collaboration where people from the US and Canada can travel to Hawaii and then go to Australia, and also vice versa, to help support all these events. I know there's a lot of the IAQA guys, and indoor air quality guys who are on the show right now, are involved in ISIAC and, those scientific aspects of that part of the industry. So anyway, everybody should support CIRI, I believe. I think they're the new journal and the scientific conference putting on, and they're collaborating with all the other industry groups. And John's done a great job with the journal. Obviously, he's done a few shows on here. So for whatever that's worth,
I appreciate it.
Turn it back to you, sir.
Thank you, Pete. I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot all about that event. And I'm glad you mentioned John and Siri. They're also one of our sponsors. I probably should have brought him on. But before we go, we've got, I don't know, Ed, it might be the first performance live of Sandstone Haze. Take it away.
Okay, so silicosis and silica control have become a real big deal in the workplace. And so this is a song about where the understanding of this really first happened, which was 80 years ago in the digging of the Hawks Nest Tunnel and in West Virginia. This is a song that was written by a late friend of mine, Mark Plummer. And so he was dying of cancer and wrote this beautiful song. Couldn't really get the actual music to us. So we've played around with the actual melody and chords here. And so Sandstone Haze, it's from it's the story of one of the unfortunate workers who died in digging that tunnel out. Digging in this tunnel for the millionth day. Old rock dust just stares at me through a sandstone haze. Getting hard to work my shift, can't seem to catch my breath. You know I ain't the only one staring at the face of death. Back at camp, can't get no rest. I know it's time to go. Can't stop the pain inside my chest. Feel it rise and fall, Lord. Feel it rise and fall. Please, Lord, leave us away from here. I'll be with you real soon. Folks back home don't know my plight on the dark side of the moon. Whatever it is killing me, don't want to die alone. Staring at the wall in my final home. See that red hawk flying to his nest. Soon I will be flying to. Here's my last request. Don't let me go to heaven with a shovel in my hand. Don't let me go to heaven with a shovel in my hand. Rise on up before the dawn, back to the dust again. When I walk that promised land, I'll be on the mend. Lay me out at Hawk's Nest for all good folks to gaze. Digging my old grave in a sandstone haze.
Thank you, Ed. I can't think of a better way to end this show. Really appreciate having you on. I want to thank all of you for joining us today at the controls. John, you got to have faith. The Z-Man will be back next week, next Friday. It's ACGIH week. We'll see you all back here next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.